story time.
The city's bustling streets buzzed with activity as David, a weary traveler, stood at the curb, calling an Uber. He had spent the evening catching up with old friends and was now ready to head back to his hotel. His phone buzzed, signaling that his ride had arrived. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its engine purring softly. David opened the rear door and slid into the back seat. But as he settled in, he noticed something unusual: a man in the corner of the back seat, facing away from him. The man's posture was rigid, his head down, and he appeared to be wearing a long, dark overcoat that obscured his features. David's heart quickened, his mind racing with questions. Had the driver picked up someone else before him, or was this a mistake? He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Hey," David called out to the driver, his voice trembling slightly. Is this ride for both of us? Are you taking him first?" The driver, a middle-aged man with a trimmed beard, glanced at David through the rearview mirror, his eyes reflecting confusion. "What are you talking about?" the driver replied, his voice tinged with annoyance. "It's just you in my car." David's unease deepened. He turned his attention back to the mysterious passenger, who remained motionless, as if unaware of their conversation. He couldn't see the man's face, just the back of his head, and the long, unruly hair that spilled over the collar of the dark coat. "I'm not kidding," David insisted, his voice shaking. "There's someone else in the back seat with me. I don't know how he got here, but he's here." The driver's eyes met David's in the rearview mirror, and he let out an exasperated sigh. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned around in his seat to face David. "I assure you, sir, there's no one else in my car," the driver said firmly. "You must be mistaken." David's heart pounded in his chest. He was certain he hadn't imagined the presence of the mysterious passenger. The situation was growing more bizarre by the second. He considered getting out of the car and canceling the ride, but a sense of curiosity and dread held him in place. "Look, I'm not making this up," David said, his voice trembling. "I saw someone back there. I don't know how he got in or why he's here, but he's sitting right behind me." The driver's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. He glanced back at the empty back seat. "Sir, I don't know what's going on, but I can assure you that I didn't pick up anyone else," the driver said cautiously. "Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. Can you describe the person you saw?" David described the mysterious passenger's attire and the long hair that obscured his face. As he spoke, the driver's eyes widened, and he turned pale. "That sounds like..." the driver began, his voice trailing off. He seemed hesitant to continue. "Like what?" David pressed, growing more anxious by the second. The driver took a deep breath and finally spoke. "That sounds like the description of a passenger who died in a car accident a year ago. I've heard stories from other drivers about a ghostly presence in their cars, but I never believed them." David's blood ran cold. He had heard urban legends about haunted rideshare experiences, but he had always dismissed them as mere tales meant to spook travelers. Now, he was sitting in a car with a presence that defied explanation. "What do we do?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. The driver's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. "I don't know, sir. I've heard that sometimes these apparitions just disappear on their own. Maybe if we continue the ride, he'll leave." Reluctantly, David agreed, and the driver resumed the journey. The atmosphere in the car grew increasingly tense as they drove through the dimly lit streets. The mysterious passenger remained silent and motionless, his presence unsettling and inexplicable. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at David's hotel. He quickly exited the car, leaving the eerie presence behind. As he watched the car drive away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just encountered something beyond the realm of the living. David entered the hotel lobby, his mind racing with questions and fear. He would never forget the night. He called an Uber and found himself sharing a ride with a passenger who should have never been there, a passenger from the other side. The neon glow of the city cast eerie shadows on the sidewalk as Emily stood on the dimly lit street corner. anxiously checking her phone for the Uber's arrival time. The evening had grown colder, and the empty streets seemed to stretch endlessly around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a sensation that prickled her skin like 1,000 tiny spiders. Emily had always been cautious, especially when traveling alone at night. She had just finished dinner with friends and decided to call a ride to take her back to her apartment. As she waited for her Uber, she couldn't help but feel exposed in the desolate street, where the only source of light came from a flickering lamppost nearby. Minutes ticked by, and Emily's unease deepened. She kept glancing over her shoulder, scanning the area for any signs of her ride. But what caught her eye sent a shiver down her spine, a shadowy figure lurking behind a lamppost, partially hidden in the darkness. The stranger's eyes bored into her, and a chill raced through her veins. Panicked thoughts raced through Emily's mind. Why was he watching her? Was he just a passerby? Or was he something more sinister? She fumbled with her phone, pretending to check her Uber app. But her real purpose was to capture a photo of the stranger for evidence. As the flash illuminated the area for a brief moment, she managed to snap a picture of the lurking figure. He was a man with unkempt hair and a twisted, leering smile that sent shivers down her spine. The photo was blurry, but it was enough to confirm her fears. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emily decided to take action. She turned and began walking briskly in the direction of the nearest well-lit area, the golden arches of a McDonald's restaurant a few blocks away. She hoped that the presence of others would deter her stalker. Behind her, she could sense the creeping footsteps, growing ever closer. Fear gnawed at her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding like a drum, and her breaths came in ragged gasps. As she reached the McDonald's, Emily rushed inside, her eyes scanning the faces of the patrons. Desperation welled up inside her as she approached the counter, her voice trembling as she spoke to the cashier. "Please, help me," she pleaded. "I think someone's following me. Can you call the police?" The concerned cashier immediately picked up the phone and called the cops, while another employee rushed to the entrance to check on the situation. Emily's heart raced as she described the man who had been stalking her, praying that help would arrive quickly. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, and the flashing lights of a police car pulled up outside the restaurant. 2 officers entered, their stern expressions softening as they saw Emily's distress. She recounted the unsettling encounter, and the police assured her they would investigate the situation. Meanwhile, the McDonald's staff had locked the restaurant's doors to prevent the stalker from entering. The patrons, now aware of the situation, kept a vigilant eye on the entrance, ready to assist if necessary. The police officers stepped outside and conducted a thorough search of the area, but the stalker had vanished into the night. They advised Emily to stay inside the McDonald's until they could ensure her safety. She felt a mix of relief and lingering unease, knowing that her stalker was still out there. As the hours passed, Emily decided it was finally safe to leave the restaurant. The police had assured her that they would increase patrols in the area and encouraged her to take extra precautions when traveling alone. With a heavy heart, Emily opened her Uber app once more. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions, and she needed to get home. She requested a new ride and provided her location as the McDonald's. The driver accepted the request, and she received a notification that the car was only a few minutes away. Emily watched the street anxiously, praying that her new driver would arrive soon. As the car pulled up to the curb, she couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety. She peered inside, relieved to see a friendly-looking driver behind the wheel. "Hi," she said, trying to steady her trembling voice as she climbed into the back seat. "I had a bit of a scare earlier, so I'm a little on edge. Thank you for picking me up here." The driver, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry to hear that you had a rough night. Don't worry, I'll get you home safely." As the car pulled away from the McDonald's, Emily couldn't help but glance nervously at the passing shadows. Her encounter with the stalker was a haunting reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness, but she refused to let fear control her life. With the reassuring presence of her Uber driver and the knowledge that she had the support of the restaurant staff and the police, Emily took a deep breath and looked ahead, determined to move forward and not let the shadow of fear consume her. Nancy had always been a cautious person, but on that chilly evening, her life would take a dark and sinister turn. She had been visiting a friend's apartment and, after an enjoyable evening, decided to call an Uber for the ride back to her own place. The app displayed the driver's photo and car details, which gave her a sense of security. Little did she know that this ride would become a nightmarish journey into the unknown. The Uber pulled up in front of Nancy's friend's building, and she approached the car. The driver, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard, greeted her with a polite smile. His name was Mark, according to the Uber app, and he seemed friendly enough. "Hi, I'm Nancy," she said, as she climbed into the back seat. "I'll be heading to Maplewood Apartments, please." "Of course, Nancy. Buckle up, and we'll be on our way," Mark replied, his voice calm and reassuring. The night was dark, and the city was quiet as Mark navigated through the dimly lit streets. Nancy found solace in the soft hum of the engine and the distant glow of streetlights. However, as the minutes passed, she noticed a growing unease in the pit of her stomach. Mark's route didn't align with the directions displayed on her phone. They were heading into an unfamiliar, desolate part of town. "Excuse me," Nancy said, her voice wavering with concern. "This isn't the way to Maplewood Apartments. Are you sure you're taking the right route?" Mark didn't respond immediately, which only fueled Nancy's unease. She glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. It was then that she noticed something disturbing. The left side of Mark's face was grotesquely disfigured, with burned, rotting flesh and exposed bone. A scream of terror welled up in Nancy's throat, but she clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle it. Panic surged through her, and her heart raced as she tried to make sense of the horrifying sight before her. How could this be happening? What kind of driver had she entrusted her safety to? "Turn around. Take me back to Maplewood Apartments now," Nancy demanded, her voice trembling. Mark's head turned slowly in her direction, and his remaining eye locked onto her. His voice, a guttural, raspy whisper, sent shivers down her spine. "You can't leave. We're almost there." Nancy's mind raced, and terror gripped her like a vice. She had to get out of this car, away from this man with his nightmarish face. She tried to open the car door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. "Unlock the door," she screamed, her voice desperate and frantic. Mark's grotesque hand reached over and unlocked the door, but Nancy barely registered the gesture. She threw herself out of the car, stumbling onto the side of the road, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back, she just ran. As she sprinted through the dark, decrepit neighborhood, Nancy's mind raced with thoughts of escape. Her phone was still in the car, and she had no way to call for help. She needed to find a safe place to hide and figure out how to get home. Ahead, she spotted an old, abandoned house, partially destroyed by fire. Desperation drove her forward, and she scrambled through a broken window, finding herself in a dimly lit, decaying room. The air was thick with dust and the smell of charred wood. Nancy crouched in a corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and tried to quiet her racing heart. She listened intently, straining to hear any sign of her pursuer. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours as she waited, praying that Mark wouldn't find her. But then, just as she began to believe she was safe, a haunting whisper drifted through the air, sending a chill down her spine. "Nancy, I know you're in here." Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the grotesque man had followed her to the abandoned house. How had he found her so quickly? She needed to stay hidden, to remain silent. But terror clawed at her throat, threatening to betray her presence. The footsteps drew nearer, each one echoing ominously through the desolate house. Nancy pressed herself further into the corner, her heart pounding in her chest, as the dread of the unknown consumed her. And then, with a suddenness that made her gasp, Mark's disfigured face appeared in the doorway. His one remaining eye stared directly into hers, a malevolent glint of madness burning within it. "Nancy," he croaked, his voice a grotesque parody of humanity. "You can't hide from me." The room seemed to close in around her as panic surged. Nancy had to escape, had to find a way out of this nightmare. She couldn't let this maniacal driver with his rotting face capture her. Summoning every ounce of courage, Nancy bolted from her hiding spot and sprinted through the ruined house. She could hear Mark's footsteps close behind, his grotesque wheezing and whispers echoing in her ears. With a surge of adrenaline, Nancy reached the front door. She burst through it and into the darkness of the night. Not daring to look back, she ran as fast as her trembling legs would carry her, not stopping until she reached a nearby gas station, where she pleaded with the attendant to call the cop. The authorities arrived swiftly, and Nancy recounted the terrifying ordeal she had endured. They searched the abandoned house, but found no trace of Mark. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. The police assured Nancy that they would investigate the incident thoroughly, but the fear and trauma she had experienced that night would stay with her forever. She couldn't comprehend how her routine Uber ride had transformed into a nightmarish journey into the unknown, with a driver whose disfigurement seemed otherworldly. Months passed, and Nancy's life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of that night haunted her every waking moment. She had learned the importance of trusting her instincts and being cautious, even in the most ordinary situations. The world, it seemed, could be a much darker and more sinister place than she had ever imagined.
Until next time, take care.